Faza'il A'mal, More Trouble Than It's Worth, Part 22. Al-Albani and Mullah Ali Al-Qari. Deal with it.
He's talking about people that have overlooked this hadith, that the hadith exists, so you have to deal with it. And then you can say, I don't agree with it, or whatever it is, but it's there. It's there, and it has to be dealt with, and it fits in with the Quran, and it fits in with the concept of there's only one true, real existence, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
In the last episode, we dealt with the issue of hadith narrators and traditionists, and how they could be subject to jarh, which is criticism, and ta'adil, which is praise. So, who are the people that do this criticism and this praise? The three-columned screenshots that I gave you gave the individual that was under critique or praise. The second person, or the second column, gave the individual doing the critique, and the third column gave the actual critique itself. But in this video here, the approach of Dr. Israr Ahmed and the approach supported by Sheikh Omar Baloch is, this hadith exists, deal with it. And it does say, to be fair, that you can criticize its authenticity or not, but he says quite disturbingly that it is in accord with the Quran and it's in accord with Islam. If it's batil, futile, and it's weak, extremely weak, and the collector of the hadith itself, at-Tirmidhi, explains it in a different way to the way you're explaining it, how on earth can that be in accord with the Quran, Islam, and the scholars of hadith? And another example of this is something this thesis mentions, this thesis that critiques the Faza'il A'mal. And we will compare an example of two criticizers of narrators of hadith, and they are in the modern period, or the relatively modern period. But this problem exists for reason of the screenshot that I give here. A lot of the work of the FA is nothing more than reprints of previous editions. So no critical analysis is made, and it states here on this screenshot here, the high number of different versions may have helped to spread the book amongst the people. We find that when the casual observer sees numerous versions, he will assume the more editions of the book that exist and the more publishers to compete to print it, new versions will be clearer, more accurate, more in line with the author's instructions, and less likely to contain mistakes. But this is not the case with all parts of this book. They are mere exact copies of weak previous editions. And on this page we have this issue and this statement of these two criticizers of hadith. So the individual being critiqued is Ubays ibn Maymun al-Basri, and his hadith is rejected and is unanimously considered weak by scholars of hadith. Ahmed ibn Hanbal, a very famous early traditionist, Abu Nu'aym and Ibn Adi said he reports rejected ahadith. Bukhari, probably the most well-known hadith scholar of all time, said he is munkar al-hadith, he is rejected in hadith, and his hadith should not be recorded. Abu Hatim, Abu Tahir al-Maqdisi, al-Bayhaqi said he is munkar. Al-Fallas, Abu Dawood al-Saji, Abu Ahmed al-Hakim al-Haytami said his hadith is rejected. And despite this, despite these luminaries in hadith giving this description of this individual, Ubays al-Basri, we find individuals like Mullah Ali Al-Qari and Al-Albani, who are quite close to each other, although they didn't live in the same period, having radically different opinions about this individual. So in his book Al-Ilal wal-Ma'rifat al-Rijal, Ahmed ibn Hanbal said in reply to his son's inquiry about this hadith is to be rejected. In Misbah al-Zujaja, al-Busayri said the chain of narration contains Ubays ibn Maymun, and he is unanimously considered as weak. So the two radically different opinions on this is Al-Albani declared the hadith very weak, and this was in his book Da'if Sunan Ibn Majah, and he is in line with the scholars that preceded him, like Abu Hatim, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Al-Bukhari, and the like. And someone that the TJ favours greatly, Sheikh Mullah Ali al-Qari, he declared the chain of narration as Hasan, as acceptable, good. And the present author, the author of the doctoral thesis, Dr. Turkistany, he grades it in line with Albani and the other previous narrators as being extremely weak. So that's an example of how critics deal with different narrators and how a person could accept a hadith as being authentic when in fact it is extremely weak. Anyway, enough with the TJ, enough with the FA. Now we come to a thesis that is very useful for a beginning student of Hadith Sciences. It's submitted to the University of Birmingham in May 2012, and it's called The Nuzha of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, a translation and critical commentary by A.S. Hussein. And Ibn Hajar himself was a scholar who died in 852. This book is a complete translation of this little treatise that is described in the introduction as follows. Nuzhat al-Nadar fi Tawdih Nukhbat al-Fikr is one of the most famous and respected manuals in the discipline of the science of Hadith, and it's one of the last major works aimed at consolidating the vast array of literature that preceded it. In fact, it's an amalgamated style of work because it's a detailed commentary of a much shorter treatise called Nukhbat al-Fikr fi Mustalah al-Athar, and in some narrations it's called Mustalah Ahl al-Athar. The latter only consists of a few pages. So here you have this very basic treatise that consolidates a wide array of literature in a very summarized form. But the GR channel seeks to educate you. So here I give you just the contents of what this work contains, and it shows you how vast it is. We have the mutawatir type of hadith, the widespread, the mashhur, famous, aziz, the scarce, gharib, the rare, the maqbool and mardud, accepted and rejected, the fard, the solitary, the sahih, the sound, hasan, fair, shadh and mahfuz, preserved and anomalous, ma'ruf and munkar, familiar and unfamiliar, muttabi, shahid and i'tibar, parallelisms, attestations and analysis, muhkam, clear, mukhtalaf al-hadith, the contradictory tradition, nasikh and mansukh, abrogating and abrogated, mardud, the rejected, mu'allak, the suspended, mursal, the loose, mu'dil and munqati', the problematic and the interrupted, mudallas, the misrepresented, mursal khafi, the hidden loose, mawdu', forged, matruk, discarded, munkar, the unfamiliar, mu'allal, the defective, mudraj, the interpolated, maqlub, the mixed up, mazid fi muttasal asanid, which is the additions to cohesive chains. And I could carry on reading, but there's a lot of reading here to be done. I'll just give you this little piece at the end, which in addition to all these sorts of terms, also talks about the issue of the knowing the generations of reporters, birth dates, their death dates, and their place of origin and travels. Other rulings related to jarh wa ta'dil, knowing the names of the fathers of the reporters, knowing the etiquettes of the student and disciple, the age of hearing and delivering reports, travelling in pursuit of hadith, types of hadith compilations, the reasons behind the hadith, and a final religious prayer. So a lot of information in very few pages, completely translated for any budding student of this science. Stay tuned for many more parts.